Welcome everybody to this year's Disability History Month launch. This year we're doing it only online. Other times we've done it online and in person, and maybe next year we might do that again. But it was very difficult to stream it from where we've been holding it in the last few years in the basement of the National Education Union, and we thank them for their support continuing. But we decided not to do that this year, and so we're doing it live. As you know, our theme is disability, livelihood and employment, or disability, employment, livelihood. And the first image that you see there, which is our large logo for this year, which is on our website, so you can download it, is very much to do with the world of work. This is meant to be some sort of workplace. And through the windows of the factory, the workshop, you can see different episodes, the National League for the Blind March, deaf workers in the munitions factory in the First World War, the logo and various trade unionists and people demonstrating for the right to work. And then on the bottom, we've got livelihood, salary, wage, and compensation. And under that, union PIP, personal independence payment, dole, strike, ESA. Can we have the next slide, please? To explain where our logo comes, if you're new to us, we adopted the black triangle, which was what disabled people who were incarcerated by the Nazis before they were eugenically killed had to wear in Germany. And of course, it was with the apex of the triangle downwards, as you can see from these people who were in camps, concentration camps, and were then exterminated. The German government admits, and this monument, a blue one in the center of Berlin, has all the names of the 275,000 people who were killed in Germany. But certain scholars think in the greater occupied territories of Germany, including all the occupied countries, it may have been 1 million disabled people. And in the lead up to that is a poster there of the useless eaters and how much extra they cost. And this is, of course, a worry for all of us in the disability world now, with, again, the possibility of our lives being put into the mix of assisted suicide. So Disability History Month then stands for celebrating our lives at whatever stage we've been, but also challenging the disableism, which is the oppression that has been with us ever since human beings have been around, really, and the struggle to achieve equality. Next, please. So we take a social model approach to disability in the Disability History Month. So an impairment is when part of your mind or body doesn't work or does not work like most people's. There are many types of impairments, but they are all long-term and impact on how you do ordinary things. With adjustments, disabled people can do them, but often differently. These could be doing difficulties walking, seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, and a whole range of other things. And really, we're about valuing difference. And we'll go on to the next slide. But it isn't our impairments, and these impairments come from accidents, wars, disease, our genes, poverty, hunger, and stress are the main causes. Of course, there may be others, but these have been around as long as human beings have been around, and therefore impairment is part of the human condition and always has been. Next. But it's really the barriers that cause us problems. In order to understand this, you have to see people with impairments as a collective. It doesn't really matter what type of impairment we have, because what we find is that there are always barriers of attitude against us, barriers of environment, the way the environment is designed, and organization, the way things are done, rules, laws, practices. And we can apply those barriers to the world of work. And it's very clear that employers' attitudes currently are against the more than 1 million disabled people who want to work but can't get a job. And despite disability confident and other measures that the last government have introduced, the numbers haven't really gone up that much. They did go up a bit, but now the gap is still quite large, as we'll see in a minute. The environment, many workplaces are not designed for people. They're not built on the principle of universal design, and reasonable accommodations are not there for us. And the way things are done are often prohibitive of the way that disabled people want to do them. We saw a light under COVID with everybody moving to working from home, which of course means that people can do things in their own way. But there's now quite a backlash against that, which is of course against disabled people who much benefited from doing most of their work from home. We can't get rid of our impairments. Occasionally medical science has a breakthrough, but by and large, we are disabled because there wasn't a medical solution rather than there was. But we can get rid of the barriers. So we're about restructuring work, society, everything in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which say that not doing this is a breach of human rights. Next. So you'll hear a lecture from David Turner in a little while, and he'll talk more about this, but disabled people have always sought a means of surviving in society. But attitudes change, and often new barriers emerge. So when skilled workers had to go on the tramp, here's a picture of a disabled man with his daughter going on the tramp. The Admiral's messenger, a veteran of the war, is still being given the messenger job. The blind Kurds and whey seller in Cheapside. Renoir, the painter, who, as he developed his impairment, couldn't really paint without being in his wheelchair and adapting, had to tape his brush to his hand and even use his mouth. We also had the people campaigning from the 80s onwards for, this was Hampshire Centre for Independent Living, that they didn't want to live in institutions. They wanted their livelihood at home with independent living and, if possible, support to get work. And of course, when there was a shortage of labour, that was always the case. In the Second World War here, we have a female amputee riveter brought into the workforce who wouldn't normally at that time be working, and deaf munitions workers in London in 1418 war, when there was again a great shortage of labour. But it isn't true to say that disabled people, there was a dramatic shift that they couldn't be in work. And as we'll hear later on, certain things prohibited disabled people, particularly those with learning difficulties, who were called feeble-minded, and the eugenics movement at the end of the 19th century very much went against them. And it was felt that for eugenics reasons, which were of course based on false science, they should all be rounded up in separate sex institutions for the whole of their lives so they didn't reproduce their own kind. Of course, those ideas led to what I talked about in the second slide, the Nazi final solution of disabled people. And we are always vigilant about this attempt to actually get rid of the useless eaters, as the Nazis called us. Of course, these South Wales miners, all amputees because of falls, rock falls, but many of them went back to work with prostheses or even without, which is interesting because it goes against the idea that once you're disabled, you're not in work. And of course, another theme we'll need to look at is that industry itself and work is often dangerous and creates impairment in its own right. And that's why there's been a long battle for what one lot of people call red tape, particularly those who wanted to get us out of the European Union. They wanted to get rid of the health and safety legislation and other things. Those were things that people fought for very hard to make work safer. And we are still vigilant to keep it that way. Next. So if we look at the population, 14.8 million people in the UK between 16 and 64 who are in the labour market, not those in higher education or further education, are classed as disabled. That's 10% who have a large limitation, 23% who have some sort of limitation, and 36% if you add in people with congenital conditions such as heart and lung, which actually under the disability discrimination legislation do count as disabled. So this is a large population and getting larger every year. Next. if we look where that population is working, we see there's a huge variation in the different sectors of industry. And so most of those below other services on there should be doing much more to get people in. We can see that human health, social work activities have a considerable number of disabled people working there compared to non-disabled. Then next comes retail sector and repair of motor vehicles, then education, all have high proportion of disabled people in work there. Then as we go down, public administration, local government, civil service, quite a high proportion, manufacturing less, personal, scientific, technical activities, because they often rely on higher levels of education, and we know that disabled people are much disadvantaged in education. Other services, accommodation and food services, that's the restaurants and hotel sector, not many disabled people there. Construction actually got slightly less. Administration support service, it would seem to me that that would be an area where many disabled people could be working. Transportation, storage, information communication, which is largely done from a desk looking at a PC, and yet we're massively underrepresented there, as in the financial and insurance sector. And for some reasons in mining, energy and water supply is a strong manual activity. Real estate activities, estate agents massively underrepresent disabled people. Agriculture, forestry and fishing, again, we're massively underrepresented there. So we can see that there are some industries where really disabled people are not there in any real numbers and need to be. With the shortages of labour that we have now, we will need more reasonable adjustments and more policies from employers in those areas and trade unions that cover those areas to do more. Right, next slide, please. Yeah, and then if we look at the different types of impairment, as these are all from government statistics, it wouldn't be necessarily as we as disabled people would identify them, but people with stomach, kidney, liver, digestive problems are the largest group, then chest, severe disfigurement and skin conditions, difficulty hearing, these are the big groups, problems of disability connected with neck and back, then mental health, depression, bad nerves, anxiety, problems connected with legs or feet, heart, blood pressure, circulation, problems concerned with arms or hands, diabetes, progressive illness not included elsewhere, difficulties in seeing, mental illness and nervous disorder, severe or specific learning difficulties, which is just over 20% for the whole adult population. But for young people, as we'll talk later, if you include autism, it's 4.8% of the cohort between 16 and 30. So this is really quite a problem. Epilepsy is also very low there. So we can see that there are certain impairments where employers are not very happy with employing people at all from those areas. Next. And I would suggest that's a hangover from the eugenics days. Geographically, we can see that there's quite a split. The gap between disabled people who are not and those who are not disabled people has actually, with the purple line is the non-disabled people, and the green line is non-disabled. So the labeling is slightly wrong on that diagram for some reason from the House of Commons Library. But the gap has remained fairly similar. It's come down by 5% from 2014 with a gap in the COVID year but it's still 27.9% between disabled, non-disabled people who are around 81% this year and disabled people who only 54% of them in work. These are people of working age. And if you look at the map, there's an answer there in that the high concentration areas are areas of traditional industry, Cornwall, mining, fishing and farming, South Wales, mining, ironworks, Scotland, the Central Belt, Manchester, that area, the northwest and in the northeast, all areas where primary and manufacturing industry were dominant, and they've left a long impact on the way that they've affected people who are still up to 66 in the workforce. So that's where we are on the whole dimensions of it. Let's go on to the next one, please. But as I said, impairment and industry have been linked all the way through. And this is from Labour Leader, The Toll of Industry. And it says, during the year 1910, 3,474 persons were killed and 379,902 were disabled whilst in work. This means that if a procession were formed of victims of industry, it would stretch 43.5 miles with a corpse every 20 yards. Between each corpse, 100 disabled work people would be marshalled, marching 5 abreast. And if the widows and orphans followed in the procession, it would be 45.5 miles long. In each 100 disabled work people, there would be approximately 45 miners. This shows the incidence of impairment in the industry, 41 factory workers, 14 persons from the following occupations: railways, seamen, dockers, quarrymen, and those employed on construction work. Those are the dangerous areas, and where there has been a push for health and safety, and things did improve and have improved, but it's not the case that it's improved everywhere. Many of the industry that has been exported to other parts of the world, you get this high level of fatality and injury going on there, which may be one of the reasons why companies did it. Next. But throughout this period we're looking at, there has been resistance from disabled people for the right to work and to organise, and sometimes their colleagues have fought for them, their non-disabled colleagues as well. This was a recent protest about the number of benefit deaths, which were identified in a BBC programme. 87 killed in the last year, took their lives because of benefit being taken away from them. The Match Girls strike was one of the big upsurge in trade unionism, which spread from skilled workers to everybody in the 1880s. And these girls at the Bryant and May factory in East London came out. They were at risk because they got what was called fussy jaw from putting the phosphorus on the matches. So many of them would have been disabled by their work, but they still wanted to be paid more and go back. The National League of the Blind, in this march they led in 1920, they were formed in 1888 and joined the Labour Representation Committee and the TUC, representing blind workers, and their banner says justice, not charity. And up on the top there, we've got pneumococinosis, the deadly dust. This was after the nationalisation of the mines, which happened in 1947. But the new high-speed cutting devices created more of a problem with lots of dust and many miners getting black lung. So all through this time, people who've collectively organised, not just unions, but the community in which these industries are, have formed. And since the Disability Discrimination Act, which was largely fought for and won by disabled people in 1995, it covers trade unions as well. And we've seen a big shift. RMT, Unite, the largest union, and the second largest Unison there, all with logos attracting their disabled members and organising their disabled members. And then annually, there's a disabled workers' conference of the TUC. So we can see that resistance is there and is built strongly into disabled people's lives in work. Next. Is that the last one? Okay. Thank you, Thomas. We can close that down. Okay, so I'm going to show you a clip in a minute from Micheline Mason, who was a great stalwart of Disability History Month. It was in discussions with her in 2010 that I decided that we needed to have a Disability History Month. We had Black history, we had women's history, we had traveller history, we had LGBT history. We didn't have a Disability History Month. So we launched it with about 80 organisations in 2010. And since then, we've kept it going, and I've stayed as the coordinator. But Micheline was very much part of it, and her thinking was part of it. And I want to show a clip now from the first Disability History Month in 2010 with Micheline. And of course, Micheline died in September. So this is really as a tribute to her. So let us go on this one.
I have seen such an enormous change in my lifetime in this area. When I was born, in the 1950s. To be disabled was a terrible tragedy. It was just seen as a life sentence, really. At the point a child got a diagnosis, they would be called handicapped. The parents were usually told everything they would never achieve, they'd never be able to do. The expectations for their life were extremely low. Certainly for me, it was never expected that I would leave home, I would get married, that I'd have children, I'd have a job, I'd have a voice in the world. None of those things were expected. There was no disability movement. Disability was seen as a God-given tragedy and possibly a punishment for past evil deeds from the parents. Parents felt full of guilt and shame. There was, as a disabled girl, there was absolutely no place in this country I could receive an education that would lead to taking public examinations. There was no differentiation between people with different types of impairments. We were all disabled, we were all handicapped, we were all the same. We all needed to be shouted at, patted on the head, and treated as children for the whole of our lives. The best we could hope for was a job at Remploy. I can remember that word filling me with absolute horror as a young person. One of the reasons I think it's so important to say all this is because of how it makes you see yourself. Apart from the actual rights you don't have, it makes you feel so insignificant as a human being. And I think what happens is that even when things change, because certainly for children now, disabled people now have far greater rights and a voice in the world. And there is a growing understanding that we are an oppressed group, like other oppressed groups. That it's the discrimination and mistreatment which make our lives so difficult. But even with those some improvements, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll feel any better about yourself. And without actually learning the history, learning that we've been part of a group who have resisted, who have come together and fought, it's been disabled people who have brought about these changes. And that is something each generation needs to know, that they are part of that group of people who chain themselves to buses, who fought for the DGA, for the discrimination legislation, who, did so many things to make lives better for ourselves and each other. That struggle and that history is not known yet. People don't know it. They still think the government did it. Kind souls in the government. Or parents did it. But parents, of course our allies played a big part in it. But it would not have happened were it not for disabled people organising, like every other group of oppressed people. We had to organise and come together and bring our own voice and learn to be proud of ourselves. It's a history I'm enormously proud of. And as Richard said, when you look back and look at how we have been treated over the years, it's amazing that it didn't work, isn't it? We're still here. We're coming out, we're getting stronger and louder and bigger all the time. So what does that say about human beings? That says something really, really important about what really matters to us. And it's a thing that I've also noticed, that despite the struggle for inclusion, an awful lot of people are using that word. And they know what it means, even if they can't explain it. And it's like, it's as if it stirred something right in the core of our beings, which everybody wants. I don't believe there's anyone on this planet who doesn't want inclusion in their hearts. I mean, it's only the fears and everything else that is stopping it. So the bigger our voices and the more platforms we get to speak, the more we will be able to move things forwards, not just for us, but to create a different kind of world to live in.
Brilliant.
Okay, now I've talked to Micheline's daughter, both at the wake and celebration of Micheline's life and since. She's ill today, but she has actually managed to do an audio recording of how being brought up as Micheline's only daughter, a daughter who all the doctors and everybody else told Micheline never to have. But she said, why should I get rid of a child who's got my condition? It's like getting rid of myself. So let's hear from Lucy about her understanding of her mother in this situation.
Firstly, I want to say I'm so sorry not to be there with you all today in person. I've been coming down with a bit of a bug, and I'm heeding my mother's advice to treat myself gently. What can I say about my lovely mum? Firstly, how lucky I am to have had her as my mum, and how proud I feel to have been the daughter of such an exquisite thinker. Having a parent who also identified as a disabled person and was able to model for me living a quote-unquote big life, as she put it, set my life on an unusual and wonderful path full of meaning and connection. Many of you will know that my mum spent the first 3 years of her life in hospital, then was home educated until the age of 14. These experiences were the foundation of her work around inclusive education and disabled people's liberation. She fought so hard for me to be able to live a life full of choice and opportunity, and for me to feel that I could have equal access to the world. She understood all the elements that would need to fall into place for this to happen, and campaigned not only for inclusive education and better employment opportunities for disabled people, but also became one of the most skilled listeners I've ever met. She understood deeply how to help people recover from the hurts of oppression, and I think this is her real legacy. One of the beautiful things that's happened since she very sadly passed has been witnessing the amount of people that have come together in her honour. There is now a group with more than over 100 people in it who have committed to meeting regularly in order to listen to each other, support each other's activism, have fun and just get hugs, all of which she would have approved of. You are more than welcome to join. My hope is that this group will take forward campaigning for the legislative agenda that she would have supported, including training many more young disabled people to be disability equality trainers and to have the confidence and capacity to lead, giving the Equality Human Rights Commission stronger powers to implement disability equality, encouraging creative, sustainable future employment opportunities for disabled people, stopping benefit sanctions and raising benefits for those who can't work. And with that, I wish you all lots of love and hope to hear from you in the organising activist Let's Change the World cuddle circle soon.
Thank you so much, Lucy Mason. Two strong personal views there, which have in their own way changed hundreds and thousands of people, which I think is what we're about in a movement, a social movement that instead of seeing this as an individual problem, sees disablement as an oppression which actually infiltrates all parts of our society. Let's now move to David Turner, the historian, who will give us more of a view of how disability and employment has been shaped, particularly over the years of the Industrial Revolution. So we've been talking to David Turner, professor at Swansea and a historian. He's going to give us a short view of disability, employment and livelihood. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so let's start by thinking about what things were like before the Industrial Revolution. And I think what's really important to emphasize is that there was expectation that everybody would work if they were capable of doing so. And so we find plenty of examples of disabled people doing various things. For example, in the census that the authorities in Norwich took in 1570 of the town's poor population, we have an entry for Elizabeth Mason, who's an 8-year-old widow, and she's described as a so-called lame woman of one hand. But in spite of that, she is spinning and winding using one hand. So local authorities like those in Norwich, they often sort of using some of their resources to try and keep disabled people in work. So they are supplementing their wages in various occupations ranging from sort of shoemaking to shopkeeping and agricultural work. And we even find some trades which are particularly associated with disabled workers. One of them is the tailoring profession, which was something where lots of boys with mobility impairments were apprenticed into. And that's because they could do it sitting down. So that particular trade becomes associated with disabled people. The Industrial Revolution is often seen as marking a really decisive change in disabled people's work experiences. So before the Industrial Revolution, the argument goes people mostly worked at home, that they had more flexibility to work at their own pace, and they were surrounded by their loved ones so that they had more support. When industrialization comes along, there's an assumption that disabled people were excluded from the workforce because of mechanization. So work became faster, hours of work became more regulated, and standardization also had an impact on the flexibility with which people could work. That's a theory at least, but in practice, historians have shown that industrialization is a much more complicated process, and therefore disabled people's experiences are much more complex. So if you look at the 1851 census, for example, right in the middle of the period we think of as the Industrial Revolution, about a third of adults worked in some kind of manufacturing, but only 5% of those people worked in factories, which is sort of seen as the place where these really big changes are taking place. So we can't generalize too much about experiences of work, and this general principle that disabled people were expected to work as far as they're able to, this continues right through into the industrial period. So we also sometimes tend to think about the Industrial Revolution as a moment where disabled people are segregated from society because their families found it difficult to look after them. They're increasingly shunted off into workhouses or other kinds of institutions. And we do find more disabled people in workhouses in this period. But what's also striking from lots of sources is just how common disability was on the streets of industrial towns and cities in the 19th century. The slide here shows workers at the Cyfarthfa forge in Merthyr Tydfil, a big iron making town. And when the London newspaper, the Morning Chronicle, visited Merthyr in 1850, its correspondent noticed that he said the streets are thronged with the maimed and mutilated. And he goes on to say that in a distance of 100 yards, I once saw 3 men moving in different directions, 2 of whom had lost a leg and the other both legs. And he then goes on to say there's a frequent practice for men disabled in this manner to learn to play the harp, by which means they earn a precarious and scanty subsistence. And you find these kind of descriptions elsewhere. In fact, one doctor estimated in Leeds in 1831 that only 10% of the working population had full health. So the important point to make then is that disability is normal in industrializing Britain. But what of disabled people's work experiences? Well, For some people, like the person mentioned by the Morning Chronicle, this might involve going into other areas of work, like working as musicians. But it's also striking that disabled people weren't automatically excluded from the kind of industries that we associate with industrialization. So you do find disabled workers in factories in the early 19th century, and you do find a lot working in or around coal mines. So mining is an industry where there's very high rates of mortality, and but for every person killed, maybe there are 100 more who are seriously injured in accidents, some of whom would be left permanently disabled. Of these people, you do find some actually going back to work underground. So you do find records in the 19th century, accounts of people with wooden legs working at the coalface underground. But mines are diverse workplaces. There are hundreds of jobs at a 19th century coal mine. And so other men found work on the surface, maybe looking after the lamps that miners took with them when they descended the pit. This was in part a consequence of the high levels of disability. So there was a kind of moral obligation on the part of employers to try and find men work. I mean, there are good employers and bad employers, but there was this sense that employers would try to find some work if that was available. Sick and impaired people face pressures to work. Okay, so we need to sort of understand this in the context of fear of the consequences of not working. So particularly fear of the stigma of being reliant on poor relief, or even, or in worst case scenarios, being sort of forced to go and live in the workhouse. So that fear seems to be driving people on, that sort of desire to support themselves and contribute to the well-being of their families. There's also, I think, the threat of losing work to non-disabled co-workers. So, you know, so that might have forced people to continue to work when really they would be better getting support at home. The whole variety of enabling and disabling factors, ranging from the attitude of employers, which could vary across different sectors. It might depend on the variety of employment in a particular area. So it's a diversity of other occupations that people could go into, what kind of family support someone had, and of course, you know, the conditions of individual impairments, which might determine exactly what you are able to do. We find disabled people working in industrial communities. For example, we find lots of disabled people working as school teachers in mining areas, which perhaps shows that their communities wanted them to have jobs of status within their towns and villages. What kind of support were there for people who weren't able to work? Well, in dangerous industries such as coal mining, disability acts as a spur to the growth of trade unions. So mass meetings, trying to get men to join trade unions, often referred to the threat of disability and the lack of support available for disabled people. So the union was seen as a kind of safety net to that. And by the 20th century, unions are playing a really important role. A lot of the work of mining trade unions by the beginning of the 20th century is in fighting for compensation on behalf of disabled members. Friendly societies were voluntary associations where workers paid a proportion of their wages into a fund which they could draw on if they fell ill. This was really geared towards short-term sickness. So if you're off work for a few weeks, friendly society could be really helpful. But if you are off work permanently, then friendly societies weren't geared up to help you because the level of support tailed off over time and often was limited to just a couple of years. So that meant that some workers, like coal miners, tried to devise their own forms of welfare. So in the 1860s in the northeast of England, the Miners' Permanent Relief Fund, which is an initiative shared between miners and employers, created a fund which did start to provide longer-term financial aid. Over time, there's increasing advocacy and activism pointing out some of the difficulties that disabled people are facing in the workplace. And we see this in particular with regard to deaf and blind workers. So in 1854, for example, Elizabeth Gilbert and William Hanks Levy established the Association for Promoting the General Welfare of the Blind, which is specifically aimed at addressing the problem of the unemployment or underemployment of blind adults. And this evolved into trade unionism, particularly the National League of the Blind, which advocated for not just for better conditions within these workshops, but for a more level playing field for blind workers trying to sell things that they made. With regard to deaf activism, a really interesting example is Jane Groom, who tried to establish a settlement over in Manitoba in Canada to liberate deaf Britons from what she referred to as the social disabilities they faced finding work at home. So prejudice from employers made it increasingly difficult for deaf people to find work, and so Groom tried to establish this new utopian community in Canada to try and to enable deaf people to establish their own community where their work could be valued. Towards the end of the century, we have new compensation laws coming in to make employers liable for accidents that happen in the workplace. So people who are seriously injured at work could receive some financial support from their employers, which might have been lacking in previous times. Particularly important here is the 1897 Workmen's Compensation Act. But if on the one hand, this was a form of legislation that was beneficial to disabled people, on the other hand, it made employers more averse to hiring people who they saw as being risky in terms of causing accidents. So when the employers' liability laws were to include medical testing of new employees, then this is often used to exclude people with pre-existing health conditions or impairments that, in the views of employers and in the views of the insurance companies that were underpinning this support, made them a risk in the workplace. So here you have an example of something which is on the surface of things beneficial for disabled people, actually working to exclude disabled people systematically from the workplace. And the idea of disability evolves around this time as well. And towards the end of the 19th century, this idea of being disabled as being incapable of doing paid labor really starts to take shape. So disability itself is very much defined in relation to the ability to work.
Okay. Thank you so much, David. I think that's given us a real insight to start our thinking off on this journey we're having in Disability History Month 2024. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we'll go straight on to Gill Crawford, who is a disability activist. I've known her for 40 years from Leeds, and she's also an archivist, and she's been David was looking mainly at the coal industry, that's his focus, but other things. She's been mainly looking at the textile industry in Lancashire and Yorkshire. And let's see what she's come up with and why that's important for us. Okay, so we're talking to Gill Crawshaw, who's been doing a lot of interesting work around the textile industry in Yorkshire and Lancashire, and particularly its impact on disabled people, both those impaired by the process, but also how disabled people got jobs within this industry. Over to you, Gill.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just going to start with a really great quote from Douglas Bainton, who's an American disabled academic, who says that disability is everywhere in history once you begin looking for it. but conspicuously absent in the histories that we write. Yeah, which obviously I just think is so true. What I've been finding out is that disabled people have always been part of the textile workforce in the north of England, but their contributions have just often gone unrecognised. And once the Industrial Revolution started, this narrative that disabled people were unable to work and had to depend on the workhouse or on charity really took hold. And this idea about disabled people being dependent and needy, I think this is something that is carried through to this day, and people still have that attitude about disabled people. If we think about people being, you know, labelled as scroungers, benefit cheats, benefit scroungers, and charity still exists and still persists. But of course, that isn't the whole story. So I've been trying to get a bit more of a balanced view, I suppose, by researching the lives of disabled mill workers who were working, particularly in the north of England, because I'm based in Leeds in Yorkshire. And these stories, yeah, you can find them if you look, you just have to look for them. I was also thinking about, you know, in academic disability studies, how the idea that it sort of mirrors a bit what I was thinking about the Victorians, you know, but the idea that once industrialisation happened, that disabled people were forced out of the workplace, that they were unable to keep up basically with the pace of the new machinery and the new factory systems. And of course, that wasn't the case at all. One of the things that we know, if you know anything about the Industrial Revolution and the factory system, then you know it was a really difficult, dangerous, horrible place to work, and that industrial injury was rife in the textile factories, in those mills. And, you know, it was so commonplace that great numbers of people became disabled as a result. They, you know, became injured and they developed impairments of, you know, the toll that the industry took on their bodies was, you know, dreadful. So you have a great number of people who became disabled as a result. And that might have been impairments, particularly of the limbs, and that might have been due to working very long hours in difficult conditions, standing for hours. And that might have been due to accidents with the machinery. There was also industrial injury through the air, the dusty, unventilated air that the workers were breathing. So people developed problems with their lungs that affected them in many cases for their whole lives. And then there was also the issue about noise, that, yeah, people became deaf as a result of the huge din of the factories, where hundreds of looms, spinning machines, other machinery would be going on constantly, a noise that, you know, that's pretty unimaginable. So industrial injury was, you know, a huge cause of disability. The industry caused disability. So of course there were many workers who were disabled as a result of that. But, you know, as you know, poor people, working classes had to work. There was no welfare system. They had to earn a living. And that meant that many of those people who became disabled as a result of work carried on working as well. And they would have carried on working because they would have wanted to avoid the workhouse and the punitive conditions of the workhouse. You know, everybody wanted to avoid the workhouse at all costs. That was really a last resort, was going to live and work in the workhouse. So they would have wanted to avoid that. Their family would have needed their money, so they would have carried on working for that reason. The industry needed a large workforce, so anybody who could get to work would work. And this is why children were employed on an industrial scale, children from as young as 5 years of age. So that meant that disabled children, disabled adults would carry on working. And in some cases, the skills would be recognised by their employers and they would be kept on because they were skilled workers. Now, yeah, that didn't mean that, you know, that people put up with those conditions passively, and this period sees the rise of trade unions. So if there were lots of disabled workers in the workforce, it follows that there would have been lots of disabled trade union members as well. Another area where disabled workers were not passive bystanders and who took an active role in the movement to reform the factories, to improve working conditions in the factories. There were people who gave evidence to various parliamentary inquiries throughout the 19th century. A particular focus on one which was in 1833, the Factories Inquiry Commission of 1833, that spoke to many people, including disabled workers. And those disabled workers were talking about the toll that factory work had taken on their bodies. Their reports very often are really similar. They're saying the same things. They were standing for hours on end in awkward positions. They were stopping machinery regularly with their knees. So, you know, moving machinery would be crashing into their knees or their legs repeatedly. So, of course, this was causing impairment on, you know, amongst many people. And some of those disabled people, despite intimidation from factory owners, spoke up to these commissions and were a really, really important part of that movement for reform. So, you know, that's really important to remember. I talked about industrial injury, but there was also those workers, and one group was those deaf people, deaf workers, who were deaf from birth or from early on, who also got jobs in the factories, in the textile factories. And we know about these from a report of a local school, the Yorkshire Institution for the Deaf and Dumb, that did a survey to find out what ex-pupils were doing. And this Yorkshire Institution was based in Doncaster, took in pupils from around Yorkshire. So this being Yorkshire, a centre for the textile industry, of course, many of those deaf young people went to jobs in the textile industry. They were working as weavers and spinners and many other jobs within the textile industry. And so we have those reports of those people, we have their names, and in some cases that means we can trace more about their lives through the census. So yeah, deaf people were working, and in fact, you know, in that noisy environment, being able to use sign language in that environment would have been an advantage for deaf workers that they had over the hearing workers. Disabled people weren't just on the sideline. Disabled people were working, they were contributing economically, they were contributing to their communities and their families, and they were contributing to that movement of reform. You know, what we're learning about disabled people, we can think about disabled people today and how our stories are often hidden and we don't get to hear those, but it's really important that we do hear those, that we do know that there are disabled people now who are doing all sorts of things, not just the famous people, but there's people who are working and contributing in different ways than working as well. We're part of society, we are there. Let's get those stories out there and heard about.
Thank you very much, Jill. Okay, so now we're going to come right far forward and we're going to listen to some young people with autism and learning difficulties talking about their experiences in Our World of Work, a film made by the National Disability Inclusion Team. So let's have that up now, please.
In June of 2023, NDTI and DFN Project Search asked young people with additional needs to talk about their experiences and hopes on the subject of work.
During these interviews, we asked you to consider how you could include somebody with additional needs, either within employment or within your workspace.
What is your experience with paid employment?
I haven't got paid employment yet.
Done volunteering experience in my charity shop and my youth club as well.
They've actually at McDonald's have offered her a job when she finishes in the summer, if they do actually honour that. But she decided herself that she wanted to try something else, so went into gardening.
Dave's Hospice.
At the hospice, that's right.
Paid employment. Well, there was a job I was wanting to go for that was working as a farm attendant assistant, which was basically teaching young people about animals.
I was in private housing, going out on visit, taking pictures. I was part of Eurovision.
I haven't had no employment, but I have had like a lot of different work experience. I want to trade in a wellbeing cafe with old people, South Asian mental health. I also have done like disability sports as well.
Did you know that only 4.8% of people with a learning disability or autism spectrum conditions are currently in work?
It's horrible. It's not very surprising. One of the first things I found out soon after I was diagnosed was like the low statistics of autistic people having employment.
I think it's terrible because it sounds like it's going down.
It's shocking.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's disgusting, really. These young people have got so much potential to offer the world that they're not given the opportunity.
I'm quite surprised. Well, I felt surprised first, but now I felt quite shocked. Because obviously, you know, adults have a learning disability or autism doesn't mean people can't let them work. That is not right. I don't think that's right.
What are your hopes for future employment?
My aspiration is to work in a nursery with young children and teaching them new skills like macarons, sign language and yoga.
So why do you want to go to work? What for?
To get a paid job.
You want to get a paid job? What do you want to spend your money on? I thought you wanted to get a car at some point.
Yeah, getting a car, Thomas.
Yeah.
What car are you getting, Casey?
The little red one that you keep seeing every time you go past.
Does that make you really happy thinking about the little red car?
Yeah, get me some welly, woman.
You're going to get some welly, are you?
So if you got a job and you paid for it, you will actually get that red car.
My hope is a like office type job. The difference will make me a better person in myself, make me more happy to be in the work.
I'm studying psychology, and so maybe into like sports psychologists or a psychologist, maybe. Like I would love to compete as a boxer one day, but that's not a job I want to go into.
I would going from your dream job is working in a hotel as a receptionist.
I'm currently in the process of actually setting up a charity that hopefully in the long-term future I will have funding that means I can get paid the living wage.
What support so far has helped you with employment?
I never dreamt that you would ever get a paid job. It never occurred to me, it never even entered my head. I mean, I didn't know about personal assistance or anything like that. So to find out all this information has been really, really helpful.
I mean, reasonable adjustments, I guess. Just finding out what can help someone, I think would probably be the best thing to do.
And maybe getting that experience and the skills for the long term when a person goes into a career.
Teaching us how to create CVs, how to create cover letters, what to do in an interview, what to expect in the workplace as well.
I am supported by personal assistant or PA. The PA asks me to get me to my work by train. It is awful when I am shown what I have to do so that I can learn.
What has been challenging about employment so far?
Maybe the first work experience I did, due to my needs, it wasn't really accessible at the start. After the first week, they tried making it accessible, but they could have done that from the start, even they knew. I was like, okay, I can deal with this because I'm a person who doesn't like causing any concerns for another person.
I find it difficult when my work colleagues speak too fast.
People without additional needs, you've got careers advisors, you've got, all these college events and other events, job opportunities and everything else there. but I have certainly not come across something similar for those with special needs.
Having an incident and then being willing to put reasonable adjustments in place. I couldn't walk back into the store because it was just too stressful. And even though they were looking at reasonable adjustments possible, it was like they were blaming me for not asking for reasonable adjustments, and I'd worked there 3 months, and I was like, well, I haven't needed reasonable adjustments up until now.
Do you have a final message to share with employers?
Ask people, I guess. Like if you know someone's coming to work with you who may need additional requirements, ask, even if you just presume, because a lot of people seem to presume they did well in an interview, they won't need any extra support.
Even if you have special needs or not, anyone can do employment if it's accessible or if it needs are met. So I think organisations should have more awareness out there.
Give them a chance.
There should be more training to make people aware of what these young people have abilities to do.
I would like to tell employers focus on what I can do and not on what I can't do. Yeah, cut.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go straight on to a disabled artist, Yinka Shonibare, who I think, you know, there are many people in the creative industries who are disabled, and he's been one who's been particularly successful. So let's hear his story. Okay, I'm speaking to Yinka Shonibare, who's a disabled artist, cultural artist, featured quite largely in British and world art in the last 30, 40 years. And I wanted, first of all, to get a bit of background on you for our listeners and viewers. Tell me a little bit about growing up. I think you grew up mainly in Nigeria and then back to the UK. Tell us a bit about that and how you've got the view that you might want to do artistic endeavors.
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up in Nigeria. I studied arts in the UK, and I became disabled when I was 19 years old. So when I lived in Nigeria, I wasn't using a wheelchair at that time. Yes, I mean, maybe because I hadn't actually grown up with a disability, I didn't know anything about disability politics or disability culture.
Yeah.
I mean, I subsequently got to know about disability politics when I started working for Shape.
Yes.
So when I left, I went to Goldsmiths College in London. And then when I finished at Goldsmiths College, I then started working for Shape part-time whilst I was kind of practicing my art.
Okay.
And my office was at Battersea Art Centre. And my job was to provide access into the arts for people with disabilities. And I worked with day centers. I was sending artists into day centers to do art workshops, and I also organized disability arts festivals as well. Yeah, I mean, so, and then I started, after working for Shape for about 6 years, I received the Paul Hamlin Award for Artists. And at the time, it was about £30,000 and £10,000 over a period of 3 years. And that actually, it was that award that really enabled me to give up my day job, as it were, and to focus entirely on my art.
Right.
Yeah, and then I was also, my work was acquired by while I was working for Shape, my work was acquired by Charles Saatchi, which was one of my major successes. And then subsequently, I was picked up by a London gallery, Stephen Friedman Gallery. And when Stephen Friedman Gallery picked me up, I was then able to live, to work full time and live on my work, because he would take my work to art fairs. And it's a Mayfair gallery, and so quite a prestigious gallery. And then I was nominated for the Turner Prize, and then I did the Nelson's Ship in a Bottle that was in Trafalgar Square, and it's a work that's now outside the Maritime Museum in Greenwich. So a number of those successes enabled me to kind of expand my practice. And so my studio as more demands came in for work, my studio got bigger. And so, currently we're not many. We're about 7 people in the studio at the moment. And then I work with larger studios, like foundries to produce my bronze pieces. And also, since the award in Trafalgar Square, I've been able to do more public sculpture. So in a way, that kind of gives you briefly a kind of summary of how my career developed.
Very good. And one of the things which I think would be particularly of interest to younger disabled people who don't have great physical mobility is that you really don't make the pieces, you conceptualize them, and other people carry that out for you, as I understand it. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I think that I don't actually make all of my own work. I do drawing, I do, printmaking. But the printmaking they come mostly from my drawings that I then pass on to a printer.
Right.
And but I think that in the contemporary art world, it's not unusual for artists not to actually physically make their own works, because you can be working on 10, 20 projects. It's not actually physically possible for you to make them yourself anyway. Even if you were able-bodied, you couldn't.
Now, you acquired your impairment when you were 19, as you said, but equally for young people who are growing up who maybe have had their impairment from early years or from birth, should their impairment be a barrier to them joining the creative industries, do you think? Or should they be able, given this emphasis now on more conceptual approaches, should it be more easy for them to actually get into it rather than the old artist having to do a 7-year apprenticeship under the master? That's all gone now.
Well, I don't think any kind of impairment is a barrier to being creative, because you have your creative mind, and creativity is mostly generated from the mind anyway. And so the physical making is just a byproduct of ideas. So that should never be a barrier. What I think people with disabilities like myself need is the support to actually do their work. So, if you have access into buildings and you have access into into studios, and if you're an actor, you have access to the stage, because that can often be a problem with many venues where you have access as an audience member, but you don't have a lot of access if you're actually one of the performers. So, and I think those are the things that as a society we need to resolve. It's not the person who has the impairment's fault, it's the environment really that's a problem. So it's more of a cultural issue. The issue of disability is cultural.
Absolutely. We would agree with you from Disability History Month on that. Now, coming on to the subject matter of what you do, it's been popular and obviously made a commercial success of it, but you're highly critical of the existing system of colonialism, of class and race. and your works are very powerful in that respect. Have you, in latter years, thought about this other barrier, the cultural barrier, and have you turned your attention to that at all for disabled people and those barriers as a subject of art?
Well, I mean, I've touched on the subject of disability in my work before. You know, I've done a series. Well, I did a series called The Picture of Dorian Gray, based on Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray. And, you know, I tend to use history as a kind of vehicle for expressing contemporary concerns. So, and I've also made Enlightenment figures into people with disabilities. So, you know, as a person with a disability, I'm multifaceted. You know, my disability is not all of me. Sure. It's just one aspect.
Absolutely.
But I'm also a member of society, and I'm free to express myself in any way that I wish to express myself, including aspects of my disability.
And may you long be able to do so, because we certainly enjoy your perspective on modern society. And thank you very much, Yinka. Okay, if we can now go on. And many creative people, I just read an article today about rock musicians, and they, of course, many of them have acquired deafness because of the high volume of decibels that they work in. So there are many occupational hazards in the creative industries as well. But we'll move on now to people who try and do something about both the employment of disabled people, but also giving them a voice, and that's modern trade unionists. And we'll start with Colleen Johnson from the National Education Union. She's on the executive of that body and is also on the TUC General Council.
I mean, that really, you know, education is a fantastic career, and that education ought to be a diverse profession is really, really important. As a disabled educator, you know, in school, you know, it's important for our young people, whether they are SEND youngsters or, you know, any other pupils. It's important for parents. It's important for our colleagues that we are there and that we are part of that education process, and that the barriers that could so easily be problematic to us are reduced or eliminated. And for me, it's really important to be a member of an education union so that, you know, together we are stronger. So if there's an issue that you've got as a disabled educator, you know, you've got your colleagues around you, you've got your union rep, and you are able to demand your rights and able to demand equality with your colleagues around you. But yeah, if we want to change the world, we've got to be part of the education system, and we've got to say that, you know, all our young people are absolutely vital, and they deserve a curriculum that they enjoy, that allows all of them to achieve, and that basically builds for a better society. So it's a huge answer to your question, Richard, and it's a really important message that, you know, value diversity, value disabled educators, and let's get the education system right. Well, I think that, you know, there are so many equality issues now. You know, there are equality issues around, you know, women's employment, LGBT plus members, you know, our Black members, our disabled members, our older members. You know, it's about getting it right. You know, and we know that there are still old practices in some unions, and, you know, everything has got to evolve and change, but things are getting a lot better. You know, at the end of the day, you know, there are more unions that understand the social model. I mean, I always proudly say that the NEU is a social model union, and people that know me know how strongly I uphold that. So I'm hoping that those difficult days are long behind us. But yes, we're still active on things like, you know, the gender pay gap, the disability pay gap and such like, you know, the race pay gap. All of these issues are really important because, you know, the fact that you come from the fact that you have a protected characteristic should not mean that you are treated as lesser than.
So what would you say to a young person maybe who's at college, university, thinking about what profession they should go in, who's maybe have some mental health issues, neurodiverse, has a learning difficulty of one sort or another, or physical impairment? Why should they think about teaching as a career?
Because I'd always say about mental health impairment, you know, we are not robots. We are not machines. I expect, you know, in most people's lives, they'll have an episode or two of poor mental health. Most of us have, hands up, you know, I have when I was younger, and certainly when I was a child carer, it was really difficult. You know, when I was a teenager and then going into the profession, you know, and, you know, people from these different impairment groups have loads to offer. You know, there are some fantastically creative dyslexic and neurodivergent educators, you know, who think in ways that are really creative, that have got lots and lots of things to offer. So nobody wants to be this, you know, one size fits all educator. So, you know, please consider education as a profession.
Do you think that learning about disability from a social model and disability history should be in the school curriculum, and why?
I think learning about those things, as I said to you earlier, when you asked me one of your questions about projects that I've done at school, I actually think it's really important. I think it can be something that grows throughout your Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 journey as a pupil. But definitely, I think, you know, the case for overtly teaching the social model of disability in Year 5 and Year 6 is huge. I just think children get it in a way, our pupils get it in a way that some of our adults don't, I'll be honest. They're very, you know, interesting thinkers by and large. And I think you need to know your history.
Right, so one last question. There'll be quite a lot of students watching this, and lots of disabled students, not just those with physical impairments like you and me, but also those with mental health issues, those with cognitive issues, those with neurodiverse issues. What would you say to them to why they should persevere and enter the teaching profession?
Right. This is a really good question. Thank you, Richard. So when I sort of finished my degree and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew what I didn't want to do. I knew I didn't want to go into banking or insurance. So I knew basically I wanted to work with people. And when I went along for the interview for teacher training, as it was then, I wasn't sure if I could crack it, you know. I'd got into a lot of trouble growing up. People had stared at me a lot and I'd stared back and nearly got sort of, you know, almost got into fights really, because I thought, you're going to stare at me, I'm going to give it back. And so I was very apprehensive. And then I saw somebody who had a facial difference, quite a significant facial difference in the education block. And I thought, if that woman can do that, then I can do it. And don't be put off. When I asked the teachers there whether they thought I could be a teacher, they said, well.
Right, and I'm going to miss out Martin Gwyther because we had problems earlier on. Suffice to say, he's a steward at the West of England University for manual workers there, and his job is to train them in safety and IT and other things. He's on the regional committee and he's also on the executive of Unite, the largest union, and his film will be up on the website. But we'll go straight on to our last trade unionist, Natasha Hirst of the National Union of Journalists, who is really quite an amazing person. I think you should hear her before we finish. I've just got a couple of minutes after her and then we'll be closing. Thank you.
I'm profoundly deaf. I grew up mostly around the Midlands, and then I came to Cardiff for university. I did a chemistry degree. I've always been very conscious throughout my education. I've been discriminated against as a disabled person, as a deaf child. When I got to uni, I realised there was the Students' Union. There was an active disabled students campaign going on, and I got involved with that because there were so many barriers to my education on my university course. And I realised it wasn't just me, it was other people as well. So that's how I first got started as an activist. And I have never not been an activist. I think, you know, there's great value in being part of the collective and campaigning for change, making a difference in your own life and in other people's lives as well. So that's what got me started. So I did my PhD. I was elected as the president of the National Union of Students. So I actually took a sabbatical from my PhD to do that year. And then it was a case of no turning back, really. I think, you know, it just really sparked that passion in me to be an activist. And there were so many barriers in physical sciences that just prevented me from developing the career that I wanted to have. So I finished my PhD and then I left. I worked for 4 years as an equality officer for the Wales TUC. And photography had been a hobby. I got made redundant. It was a project funded role. And I thought, well, I'll give myself 6 months as a photographer, see how I get on. And 15 years later, I'm still here. While I was working for the Wales TUC, because it was a policy and campaigns role, I was encouraged to join the NUJ. So I joined as a dual member. So I was a GMB and NUJ member then. Once I moved into freelancing, I just became a full NUJ member. But it's only really once I fled domestic abuse and spent quite some time sort of in refuge and not being able to work because of PTSD. And it was after that I got involved with the NUJ because I thought, okay, I need to get my career and my life back on track. I need to meet people, network, find work, you know, get some solidarity around me, some support around me. And that is when my life kind of really started again.
And I know it's more than 35 years ago that the NUJ first produced guidelines on disability and representation. How is that going these days? Is it still an issue within the union?
It's a key issue for us. So we have a Disabled Members Council. I represent disabled members on the National Executive of the union. And we've been very concerned about the negative rhetoric, very dangerous portrayal of disabled people because it has a real life impact in the way that we're treated. You know, we've seen an increase in hate crime, disabled people in poverty and hardship as a result of sanctions and not being able to access the support they need. And we want to make sure that journalists understand these complex and often nuanced issues and that they are reflecting that when they're reporting on disability issues rather than just regurgitating whatever comes from a government statement without giving it proper scrutiny. We've run a series of webinars for members and non-members. We did one earlier this year that explained the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, what was going on in terms of the delegation going out to Geneva to give evidence, what we were hoping journalists would do in scrutinising what the government was saying in their evidence. And we have another webinar coming up in December that will be bringing together those reporting guidelines and having conversation with members and non-members about how disabled people are portrayed in the media and what we need to be doing collectively to challenge those dangerous negative stereotypes and create a much fairer and nuanced way of reporting on disability.
What are some of the barriers that disabled members face in journalism and how does the union counter those?
It starts from education. I mean, there are some students who have health conditions, have fluctuating energy and, you know, fatigue levels. that mean that a newsroom environment probably isn't going to be the place for them. But there are so many different roles in journalism, that there's so much that disabled people can still do as a journalist. But we've come across the attitude that if you need extra time for your exams, or if you need to start a bit later in the day, then you can't be a journalist, and that is absolutely untrue. And it's really important that we're challenging those stereotypes within education, making sure that the reasonable adjustments are there for students who are studying, but also, more importantly, finding other routes into journalism for those who perhaps, the traditional sort of university route isn't the right thing for them to do. It's really important that we're increasing diversity in journalism, that the diverse kind of life experiences of our audiences are being reflected, that they see themselves represented. So it's really important that we have more disabled people in journalism. What we're often finding is, as with, it's common across different industries, but employers who just don't have a very good understanding of reasonable adjustments and what that means in practice, how they can put the right support in place. There are some employers who are doing really, really good work. The BBC has got a great sort of program of outreach, creating ring-fenced roles for disabled people, active staff networks, really, really good stuff going on there. So there's good practice, but it needs to be more widespread. We have an absolutely brilliant bunch of activists on our Disabled Members Council, different parts of the UK, different impairments, different backgrounds and lived experience. We bring our lived experience to bear, and also what we have learned from other disabled members. We have disabled members meetings, so members can bring their issues to us. We have our webinar series and stuff like that. Sometimes we'll take motions to our delegates meeting, which is our policy making conference we hold every 2 years. And then that forms a work plan for the Disabled Members Council. And I think it has shown that you can have a disabled leader who is effective, who can do a really good job of representing the union, representing all members. And it shows others that when you've got your access requirements in place, there's no stopping you. And I think it's really important to have those kind of role models in leadership and decision-making roles within our unions.
And that's Natasha Hirst, who is actually the national president of the NUJ and also is on the TUC General Council. So we've heard from people at the top of the trade union movement, but of course underneath them are thousands of reps and disability champions we now have in many workplaces. The problem is only 20% of workplaces are unionized. So we need to get unions out into many other places, because that is the only way really that we're going to develop proper, effective implementation of the legislation that we have. But let's have my last slide up, Thomas, and I'll wind up, and I might just do a short poem from Micheline to give us something to think about as we finish. But I'll have my last slide first. Okay, first of all, on the left, a cartoon from Crippen, who's always supported us, the disabled cartoonist, which, as a woman sitting down typing, I wonder what they'll say if they ever find out that we're just recycling old Tory lies. Don't start thinking, Liz, just keep with the programme. And this is about blaming disabled people, work-shy scroungers, fraud, etc. And there's been some of that going on in the early autumn, and we hope that the new Labour government will move away from that. Because that legacy, it isn't just, as the Chancellor said, to avoid going back to austerity. It's also necessary to avoid using the disabled stereotypes that the last government used to actually make the life of disabled people absolutely appalling in this country. But let's go on a more positive note. So what is to be done about this employment gap, and particularly that shocking figure of only 4.8% of young people with autism and learning difficulty in work? So what we need to do is develop inclusive education and training for disabled young people's confidence. We also need, and this is something you can all write in by the end of next week to the curriculum review, that we need to have disability on the curriculum for everybody to learn about it as a social oppression, and we need to adapt the way that teaching and learning is done so everybody can achieve. Secondly, we need to give the Equality and Human Rights Commission stronger powers to implement disability equality, as Lucy already said. If in work, join a union and champion reasonable accommodations for disabled colleagues. You may have to found the union, and it's lawful to have a ballot when you get a majority of your colleagues in it, and the employer can't stop it. Tax incentives for employers, positive about employing those with autism and significant learning difficulties, so the government actually giving an incentive. Encouraging traditional crafts, a sustainable future employing disabled people. We need to look at the crisis. We can't continually have growth. We have to go to a steady state economy, and that will mean things like plastics going back to working leather, wood, and other natural things, so that many of those crafts that disappeared with the industrialization will need to come back so we can have a sustainable future. Restore free access and legal aid to the employment tribunals. Employment tribunals are very effective. There's no limit on the amount of fine that they can put on an employer if you win your case. But of course, David Cameron took away free legal aid and charged £400 to go to an employment tribunal. So we need to get that out of the way. We need to raise the level of benefits for those who can't work so that they actually are reasonably tied to the living wage, and taper benefits favourably for those who want to get into work but can't afford to work full time. And lastly, we need a big expansion in access to work, which is the government's payments, best kept secret. Still only 49,000 people on access to work, which is giving you the extra support that you need to get into work. That should be in the millions by now, and it isn't, so it needs to be expanded. So that's that. I wanted to read a poem from my dear friend Micheline, which gives us pause for thought with the bill that's come out this week about assisted dying. And she wrote this back in 2006, because this isn't the first attempt, it's about the 10th attempt to do this. And this is what she had to say. Not dead yet. I have lived to see another spring, to breathe in the blossom's perfumed air, to feel against the sun's warming my skin, to wonder at the life we share. I can touch again those I care for, with my hands, my mind, my heart, that touch me as if for the first time. New thoughts, our dreams just start. Physical pain I have known plenty. Impairment holds little fear for me. But to feel unwanted, a burden, a weight, is the intolerable pain I flee. The answer cannot lie in murder made easy, in fueling guilt, complicity and dread. It lies in the courage to create a kinder world in which no one would choose to be dead. Happily, I am not dead yet. I have lived to see another spring. I will use every precious moment I have left, this welcome change to bring. So pause for thought, whatever your views on the assisted dying bill, because of course there is pressure, and pressure can be exerted in many ways on people. And they can exert it on themselves when pushed in a certain way. Do we really want to go down that road? It is a slippery slope. Look what's happened in Canada. But we need to also think about employment of those disabled people who at the moment are not wanting to kill themselves, but are wanting a job and to be part of society. And I hope you'll all do your bit over the next month to use our resources, to hold meetings all over the place. If you're holding a meeting, send it in to us and we'll put it up on our events page. We've already got a lot there. I was looking today, at least 10 universities have got a big program going. I'm sure there are many others around the country. So thank you all for staying with us. Sorry for the technical hiccups at the beginning, but I wish you a prosperous and happy and productive UK Disability History Month this year. Thank you.